Great. So today I'd like to welcome all of our audiences to another STACchat. This is our sixth STACchat, actually, since we started doing these back a few months ago. And today we're delighted and really honored to have Dr. Camille Burge be our guest. Dr. Burge is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science at Villanova University's College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And Dr. Burge's research lies at the intersection of political psychology and the racial and ethnic politics. She is in the process of finishing her book, Ready to Go, Pride, Shame, and Anger in Black Politics. And we'll all have to be looking out for that publication date for sure. And I also would say that in 2014, Dr. Burge received the Louis Baker Award for Best Paper on Race and Politics from the Midwest Political Science Association for your paper titled For the Meaning and Implications of Racial Resentment Across the Racial Divide. So again, Dr. Burge, thank you for your time and for joining us. And I guess I'll just jump right in. You mentioned and you did a paper around the racial divide. I'm wondering if you could describe for our audiences exactly what you're referring to when you talk about racial divide, and then how wide is the divide in your view?
Woo, that's a big question. So in that paper in particular, my co-author, who was my dissertation chair, Cindy Cam, and I, we look at how Black and white policy opinions differ. And so what the research suggests is that there is an incredibly large gap between how Black and white Americans evaluate policies, and especially racial and redistributive policies like affirmative action and welfare. And so in that paper in particular, we're just taking a deeper look into that gap with political science measures to try and understand if there's anything that can help bridge that gap or anything that can help explain some similarities in racial attitudes that we actually see between Blacks and whites, as opposed to them staunchly being on the opposing sides of the fence.
Right. And do you think that's why I would argue that, our government across all levels of government, have really not addressed and prioritized dealing with, the racial issues in our society? And is that because of they're representing constituents that are divided and they're playing it safe? Or is it, you think, their own prejudices or biases that impact how they get things done in Washington or, New York State in this case, or in Pennsylvania?
So, I think it could be a bit of both. So, is it just their constituents or is it something else? And so I think it's been a lack of support from their constituents and maybe something else. So I think when it comes to constituents, we have to think about who those constituents are, right? So who's eligible to vote and participate? Who are the candidates that our elected officials, are being responsive to? Are they interest groups? Are they, historically speaking, as they were in the past, white male property owners of a certain age? What's the commitment that these individuals or groups that they're trying to be responsive to, what's their commitment to social justice reform? What are the real life stakes for these individuals or groups if social justice reform were to be enacted? And so what I think we're seeing now is not only a change in the constituents, but also a change in their desires. So people saying that we need to do something about climate change, about prison reform, healthcare, wages, police brutality, the list goes on. And along with this change in desires of constituents, politicians will then aim to champion those issues as they attempt to get elected. So we should see that playing out in the electoral space.
Yeah.
Something else, beyond constituents, I think it's a true mindset and heart change. So in my opinion, when we have social justice issues, especially those issues pertaining to race, we ultimately come around to throwing some piece of legislation at it or making some kind of policy change. So we'll just take body cameras for police as a more recent example, right? We want to help with police brutality issues. Well, let's require police officers to wear body cameras and to have them on while working. But we can't just have legislation or policies to support the funding of more body cameras for police, and then on the back end, wonder why Black people are still getting shot at roughly 20 times the rate of their white counterparts, right? Because we haven't dealt with why one might perceive someone to be more prone to criminality or more suspicious. We've just given someone a camera to record, the justifiable encounter. And so we have to do the work to eradicate implicit and explicit bias if we really want to move forward to bring about both meaningful and lasting change.
Yeah, that rings so true. We're putting a camera on as your example, but we're not changing the wiring of the individual.
That's right. That's right.
There are implicit and explicit biases around how they're doing their jobs.
Right.
And I asked the question as well, and I asked it of a previous guest as well. I've recently finished a book about JFK when he was running for president in his first couple of years in office, and of course, sort of desegregation was the topic then, and he worked with Martin Luther King and other Black leaders but you read, if you drop the name of JFK out and you put any other president in, the issues are almost the same. We really haven't conquered. It's like a time warp. We're now in 2020, and you could read this book thinking you're in 2020, right? So that I think has a lot to do with the frustration of not being able to really move systemically forward.
Right.
And I guess that leads me to thinking about sort of the role that anger plays, particularly in Blacks' reactions to police brutality, but more generally, and then how that affects the protests, that we're seeing today, either individually, silently, or en masse, as we're more recently seeing. But what role do you think anger plays in this equation?
Yeah, so within the political psychology literature, we know that anger is a motivating emotion. It's a stimulating emotion. So when we're angry, anger is defined as a belief that we or someone or friend group with which we identify has been unfairly slighted, right? And so the reason that we become angry is because we know who to blame for that slighting. And we believe that they could have selected an alternative course of action, but yet they chose to offend, right? That's why we become angry, because we believe that there's something else somebody could have done to achieve a different outcome, and yet they chose to offend, right? So it's who's blameworthy for the offense. That's part of this anger response. And in the political science literature, we know that when people experience anger, they're more likely to engage in costly forms of political participation, like voting, donating money to political candidates, and of course, protesting. And so the reaction that we're seeing, especially right now among Black Americans, in my estimation, is not surprising. Scholars have been talking about, Black anger since the 60s. It was a citation by Greer and Cobbs in 1968. David Allen Greer's father is a famous Black psychiatrist, and his co-author, Price Cobbs, wrote a book called Black Rage. And they were trying to understand, even in the 60s, why it is that African Americans were angry. Like, what is it that they're actually protesting about? And so what they write and what they find in this book 52 years ago is that African Americans are angry and they're protesting because of the unwillingness of white Americans to treat them as equals. And so what they argue in this work, and I mean, it is a beautiful, flowery phrase. So give me a second while I try to directly recall it. But what they say in their book is that although the practice or the civilization that tolerated slavery dropped its slaveholding cloak, but the inner feelings remained. That the practice of slavery stopped over 100 years ago, but the minds of our citizens have never been freed. And so what they're arguing in this book is that there's going to continue to be unrest unless white Americans start to treat Black Americans as equals. And that means equality before the law, equality as it pertains to education and intergroup reactions. As soon as African Americans, as Black Americans are treated like equal human beings, those things should subside. And so to go off of your point that you made earlier, we could insert any president and it seems like the same thing.
Yeah.
And it's in part because that true equality has not been realized, right? We're waiting for the heart change, right? You're not just going to be able to legislate this away and to throw some policy at it. People have to change the way that they view people that are different from them, especially in this country, people of color.
Yeah, no, for sure. It brings to mind an expression too that I've used in business, but if you're going to really do something and make it change, it has to be head, heart, and mind.
Yes.
It feels like what we do sometimes is throw a Band-Aid legislation, or throw some money at it and expect that that's going to change the heart and the mind.
Right.
And it doesn't, and it takes time and it takes hard work. There's an interesting, this gentleman was a commencement speaker at St. Thomas Aquinas College in last May, although virtually, given the pandemic, but it was Arthur Brooks from the Kennedy School up at Harvard. And he wrote a book called Love Thy Enemy. And essentially, it was all about empathy, right? And having empathy and finding those places where you can agree rather than continually, sort of arguing about what you don't agree on.
Yeah.
And I feel like you could drop that book into this conversation because it's a little bit of the same issue, right? We keep arguing around points, but we really don't step back and say, look, as a white person, as a black person, what are the common things that we can agree on?
Right.
How to move forward, build trust, take an empathy approach, and then, better things will come out of that. You would expect and hope. And so, and how do you think it's different now? I mean, I feel, and I know my own 3 grown children, they're adults now. I shouldn't even call them children, but
they're babies.
They're participating, physically in the protests and spiritually in the frustration, and they're angry that their friends, their colleagues, and our society hasn't made the change it should. And I'm wondering, is it different this time, do you think, in terms of the more, I'd say, rainbow, if you like, of the participants in this process at the moment, in these protestations and in this moment in time?
I think what you just described with your children is the exact definition of empathy, right? It's the ability to share and to understand the feelings of others and to say, like, I'm really upset because that thing is happening to you, and it could be happening to me or my kids as well, and I just don't want it to happen to anyone, period.
That's right.
And so for me, this moment feels different, right? This moment feels different to me for a number of reasons, but especially because of technological innovation. So it's not just my great-grandparents or my grandparents or my mother and father telling me stories about things that have happened within the Black community that I know about and that I might, tell my children about. It's that everyone can see it now, right? It's not just a story that's shared with an insular community that's passed down about not going to a certain community after dark, or the police might beat you up if you're on the street at a certain time and they pull you over. Everybody can see these things now, and it's not just with body cameras. We have cell phones, so people are recording things. And not only are they recording things, but they're posting them on social media. And so within a matter of seconds, if you're on Facebook Live or if you're on Instagram or Twitter, you can see these incidents happening either in real time or moments or days after they happen.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's different now.
They're unfiltered as well.
Right, completely unfiltered, unfiltered. Everyone can see it, and it's hard not to have empathy when you can see the devastation and destruction that something is actually happening. It makes it real, even if that's not your lived experience.
That's so true. You're not waiting for the 6 o'clock news on the old linear television.
That's right.
Filter what they want to show you. Now it's in real time, by real people experiencing, or observing. So that is at least for me anyway, much more impactful and relatable. Well, right. So let me ask you, so we talked about emotions and anger, and obviously, we're in an election year. By the time we get to November, does anybody realize we're not in an election year at this point? But
election?
how do you see emotions around this topic of social justice and equality, true equality in spirit and again, head, heart, and minds for Black Americans? How do you think that plays out in terms of the elections later this fall?
Well, I think it actively is playing out in two ways. The first way is that you're seeing individuals that are already on the ballot, candidates, if they haven't already, pivot to champion some of these issues, right? They are recognizing that these protests are not going away, that people are going to be calling offices and holding individuals accountable, that they are making sure that elected officials are being accountable to especially needs related to racial injustice. So I think that's a piece of it, like seeing politicians pivot to, of course, pick up votes to get elected so that they can, change and enact policy that would help bring about equality and or equity. That's one way. The other way that I see this working is, weaponizing the movement. There is a defund the police commercial that's out right now. I mean, and it's on in Pennsylvania, at least, like every other commercial that comes on.
Really?
So in this campaign ad, there's two of them, but in the campaign advertisement, it's talking about having a wait to get your reaction or your issue met by police, and how defund the police is a problematic phrase, and implying that means that if you defund the police, that they're not going to be available to handle your call because they're out doing other things, that there'll be a delay. And so in that way, that kind of narrative is being used to stoke anxiety and fear among people who believe that defund the police is what that actually means, because allocate resources from police departments is not nearly as like sexy, right?
Yeah.
Like it's not a cute soundbite. But that is designed to stoke fear and stoke anxiety, and those kinds of emotions, when they're stoke anger as well. When stoked, also have political implications, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which politicians might pivot and champion these issues, but there's also a way in which the protests and the movement right now and we're seeing it in real time, again, like will be weaponized for political purposes. Mm-hmm. But we see that in every election cycle, right? Like this is not something that's a new tactic. I'm assuming that Joe Biden and his ilk will probably come out with a campaign ad soon dealing with protesters in the Capitol. Again, what is that designed to do? To appeal to your target coalitions in whatever way that you can, and to stoke various emotions because you believe that the stoking of those emotions is going to lead to greater turnout on your behalf. So I see it actively happening in both ways right now. And it'll be, we'll get even more campaign ads, and we'll all be home to watch them as the pandemic continues.
And Dr. Burge, from your lens and the work that you do, when you see politicians all of a sudden pivot to this being an issue that they want to have in front of them, right?
Right.
Is there credibility? I mean, is credibility earned over time, or is this a reaction that people say, well, wait a minute, you're not sincere. What are you really going to do?
Right. It's hard because it's difficult to determine, is this genuine or is this pandering?
Right.
Are you pandering now just to get my vote? Or are you actually genuinely interested in these issues, and once you get into office, you're going to do something about them? And there really is no way to tell. But what we do know is that politicians on both sides of the aisle pander.
Isn't that the definition of a politician when you look it up in the dictionary?
It's right there as that B definition, right? And what I found, in some of my research that I've done with some of my friends, we were interested in micro targeting, because some of these people, some of these politicians, some of these candidates will try to pander to like different racial or ethnic groups. And so the way that they do that is a Spanish-speaking campaign ad, or an ad for Black voters that has like bluesy or rap music in the background, or a stereotypically sounding Black voice or ethnic voice, right, delivering the message. And so what we found in our work is that especially for Black politicians, you know, if you roll out the stereotypical pandering, which we did by manipulating background music in a campaign ad, if you roll that out, you're penalized more severely than the white candidate that does it, and kind of like a you should know better way. But back to the original point, like, how do you know? You don't. You just have to pay attention. And one of the things that we're not great at in American politics is we'll let the politician candidate come into the community and stand on a soapbox and deliver us all of these promises. And then they get into office and we don't hear from them again for 2 years until they need our vote again. And so the onus is on the people to hold those elected officials accountable, to understand, like, when are you in office? When are you in DC? Or when are you in your home district? What are you doing while you're there? How many bills are you sponsoring or co-sponsoring? What does your roll call vote history look like? You know, and it's on us to hold these individuals accountable so that when the next election cycle comes along, we can say, we've been watching you. And you didn't do what you told us you were going to do. So it's time for you to go. Right?
Yeah, no, exactly right. Exactly. It's all, you know, it's all about accountability at the end of the day, holding people accountable, no matter what you do in the walk of life, and particularly in politics, where you have the ability, you know, to actually affect change, on a widespread basis. Speaking about widespread basis, and you know, you're in an academic environment, as I now am, you know, at St. Thomas Aquinas College here. You're at Villanova University. What could colleges and universities, and maybe education more generally, do more of to address this issue of social justice? You know, not only in the academic sort of curriculum sense, but also, you know, student life, student engagement, and encouraging this, you know, this coming together in ways. Because, you know, I while we can do so much, I think, in colleges and universities, I also think, you know, it's late, and I think, you know, how much more could we do through the early years of education, right? And so, just wonder your thoughts on you know, from an institution that is about bettering life, is about giving people the tools and access to, you know, being a productive citizen as they get older. What are your thoughts there?
So for the academic framework, I mean, I feel like there are two things that we could do and do a better job of. First is to have, you know, required courses on social justice, not telling people what to do or think from a social justice perspective, but just exposing them to these various issues and the arguments surrounding them. I mean, I am constantly amazed by just the amount of information that most people just don't know, especially as it pertains to social justice issues. So some kind of required set of classes or a class to at least make them aware that these issues exist. And then for the academic framework, the second thing, having more diverse authors on the syllabus. So there are people from all walks of life that have written on various topics, and we need to include their voices and their research in the canon. So right now, I'm on a task force with the American Political Science Association, and this task force deals directly with citations and the lack of equality in whose research gets cited where. And so, like, why is this important? Because citations measure the impact of research ideas and how important those claims are that are being made. And so what we know based on any research that's been conducted is there's a great deal of bias against white women, against people of color, against LGBTQIA people, and anybody at the intersections of all of those identities. And so people are not being cited nearly as much as their white male counterparts. And so we think it begins, you know, with which authors are being taught in the classroom and to what extent we're incorporating the work of these individuals and placing their findings into our canonical understandings of various phenomena. So I think those are things that we could do on the academic side. On the student life side, you could always have more diversity in guest speakers in your speakers bureau. You can have more diverse events. So in February of 2020 at Villanova, there was a student-led initiative, and it was called Immigration Week. We've never had that at Villanova before. And the goal was to combat misinformation about migrants and to share the stories and the lived experiences of Villanovans. And it went over incredibly well. It was just before, coronavirus. It was like the end of February, but it went over very well. And, when you're talking about educating the entire person, like these are the kinds of events that are beneficial. Also with student life, thinking about better qualitative and quantitative climate metrics to understand the needs and lived experiences of students on campus. So focus group studies, in-depth interviews, surveys, allowing students to speak their truths anonymously, and the administration to keep their fingers on the pulse of their students and what they think, should be happening. And then the last thing for student life, I think having some kind of formal review board to report incidents of bias, whether they be racial, ethnic, religious, sexual orientation, otherwise, so that when things happen, the university knows and they can measure an appropriate response. Because one of the issues that we've seen a lot on Villanova's campus is like, well, I told this person that it happened, like an RA, and then nothing ever happened, right? Or I told a professor that was in the same department that this incident happened in my classroom, and then nothing ever came of it. And so at least having something on the university side where students and faculty and staff, but especially students, where they can report these incidents, and that the university can have a committee or some kind of measured response.
That's terrific. You raised the point about more Black authors or more diverse authors, right? And it's funny because my daughter is an editor at one of the publishing companies, and she's in the nonfiction space. And they're having discussions about, let me see your roster of authors to see what the level of diversity is, which is great. But your point about citations is really interesting. It can't just be, now that you made me think of it, it really just the authors. It's how do you embed the work of diverse, culturally or otherwise population of writers and academics to enrich in whatever the author might be, right? That was an excellent point. I'd say, like, for us at St. Thomas Aquinas College here, we're small enough where we pride ourselves on really knowing the students, that are on campus and commute. We're also, I think, fortunate in that for a number of years now, we've had a very strong criminal justice program, our largest majors here, and we have relationships with a number of sort of the police networks and criminal justice system, and a partnership with one of the correctional facilities to actually give incarcerated people a chance to get an undergraduate degree or, a master's in public administration while they're incarcerated. And then when they come out, help them to re-enter society through scholarships or what it might be. And I know that we're really focused on, social justice, but in a really authentic way to make it part of the fabric of the institution, not just a reaction to the moment of what's going on. So I do think, colleges have an important role to play. And as you say, listen to your audience, right? No matter what you're doing, listen to what's going on and let people feel safe in how they, express themselves for concerns they have, particularly with the incremental anxiety at the moment about COVID-19 and safety and isolation. I would say emotions are pretty fragile at the moment, and I think we need to be particularly sensitive, right, in how you deal with what may come down the road. So I have to say, Dr. Burge, I really appreciate your time. This was terrific insight. I think the work you're doing is admirable and commendable, and I can't wait to read your book, and we'll make sure that it gets passed around the library here and ultimately give it some publicity for you. But I thank you for your time and your insights, and I hope we can keep the conversation going.
Thank you for your time, and thank you for having me.
Great. Have a great day. Thank you so much.
You too.
Bye-bye now.